Chapter 59. No matter how you looked at it, a cloak bristling with fur stood out in a sweltering desert. But the solution to this was simple. Among the various enchantments built into it, the Cloak of Darkness also had a simple transfiguration enchantment. It was only at the level of removing the fur and reducing its thickness, but that alone was enough. In this Nahama desert where sandstorms blew constantly and the temperature dropped to below freezing at night, there were many travelers who wore such clothes. Although it would reduce its dignity. But this wasn't Eugene's opinion. Melkith el-Haya, the original owner of this cloak, had informed him about the transfiguration enchantment while adding these words at the end. Naturally, Eugene didn't care in the slightest about reducing the cloak's dignity. Arath and Kiel really are first-world countries, Eugene muttered to himself as he brushed the sand out of his hair. The reason Arath was called the Magic Kingdom wasn't just because of the 5 towers of magic and all the wizards congregating in that country. It was also because everyone in the country was extremely familiar with the use of magic. Arath used magic for all kinds of things, from the floating stations and flying carriages soaring through the sky to the magically created street lamps that illuminated the ground below. Except for Helmuth, Arath was the only country that was integrated with magic to this level. No other country was as familiar with magic as Arath. This fact stood out most strongly in the matter of warp gates. It may have been difficult to make all of those warp gates that connected the sprawling streets of Arath, but maintaining them was even more challenging. Since Arath was chock full of excellent wizards, it was possible for them to maintain these hundreds of warp gates, but other countries weren't able to do the same. Honestly speaking, even if they could, they wouldn't do it. Although warp gates were convenient, their installation came with several risks. Even in modern times, dozens of people died each year, disappeared or lost their minds due to warp failure. Here, for example, there weren't that many warp gates in his current location of the Desert Kingdom Nahama. The few warp gates that existed were reserved for the country's high-ranking nobles, and foreigners were not permitted to use them. Of course, if he used the Lionheart name, it was possible for Eugene to get permission to use these warp gates. However, since not only his master Lovelian, but even the Blue Tower Master had advised him against it, Eugene had no intention of revealing his family name anytime soon. 2. Eugene spat out the sand stuck to his lips and inserted his hand into his cloak. He pulled out 2 pieces of paper from among the various things stored within the cloak. One of them was a map of all the restaurants that specialized in serving cactus scorpions that Hera had hurriedly prepared for Eugene when she had heard that he was going to Nahama to sample the cactus scorpions. Although Eugene felt grateful for this, it was useless to him. Because he hadn't come here to this swelteringly hot, constantly sandy desert just to do something like eating some scorpions. Still, as he felt grateful for her kindness, Eugene couldn't just throw it away. The other piece of paper was a map of Nahama that he had received from Lovelian. It wasn't just any ordinary map. It was a magical map that had been linked to the spatial coordinates of wherever Eugene was standing, allowing him to know precisely where in the world he was. Currently, Eugene was in the western end of Nahama. If he went quite a ways north from here, he would eventually arrive in Taraz. Usually, if he was hoping to look for his lost tomb, Eugene should have sought entry into the borders of Taraz to visit his hometown. However, there was no longer any need for that. 300 years was a very long time. The Nahama Desert was gradually expanding its territory during this time. About once every few decades, horrendous sandstorms appeared here sporadically, advancing unnaturally and engulfing the lands beyond the desert. After 300 years of this, Hamel's hometown, the village in the frontier region of Taraz, had already become part of the desert. Taraz was just a small kingdom. They had no choice but to retreat in the face of these calamitous sandstorms and the desertification of the land, so these desert expansions inevitably became new territory for Nahama. I guess that's one way of conquering another country, Eugene mused. And with this method there was no real need to go to war. Only an idiot would be ignorant of the fact that humans were behind the desertification caused by these sandstorms. The ones responsible for these sandstorms weren't as infamous as the Black Wizards, but even 300 years ago they were already fairly notorious. In the era when the demon kings were gathering their power, the demonic beasts were being spread throughout the world, and the monsters were being driven mad. Some countries gathered their troops to face the demon kings, while other countries gathered their troops to take advantage of the opportunities left by this chaos. Nahama was one of the latter. They took advantage of the war and stationed their troops on their border with the Kiel Empire. If Vermouth hadn't come to Kiel, Nahama would have been able to invade Kiel and ascend into the ranks of empires. Nahama was a country that Eugene hadn't particularly liked even in his previous life, but even after 300 years had passed, his impression of them hadn't improved in the slightest. This wasn't because he had lost his hometown to them, however. On the contrary, he even felt a little grateful to Nahama for this. Thanks to that, Eugene had no need to try and cross the borders into two countries. There were a few things bothering Eugene. The first was the desert. The heat was no big deal, but the non-stop gusts of sand felt like shit. Fortunately, Eugene's situation wasn't too bad, thanks to the storm sword WYD. Using the sword, Eugene was able to summon wind spirits who helped him shed all of this sand without having to take a bath. However, the gusts of sand weren't the only problem in this desert. The desert was both vast and barren. No matter where you turned to look, there was only sand. After passing by the warp gate on the western border, he hadn't seen a single village, let alone a city. This didn't really matter that much. He already had a map that would keep him from losing his way even in this vast desert, and he had plenty of food and water packed in his cloak. As for the lack of shelter, well, that certainly might be a difficult challenge for a young master of the prestigious Lionheart clan who had grown up in the lap of luxury. But for Hamel, who had been forced to live the life of a wanderer from a young age, he was already used to it. So even though the desert was cold as hell at night, when he lay down covered by the cloak of darkness, Eugene was actually put into a cheerful mood as he recalled the good old days. It's nice to be able to see the stars so clearly, Eugene thought positively. Wrapped up in his cloak, Eugene stared up at the night sky. Although the night skies of Kiel and Doroth were also quite beautiful, they couldn't compare to the sky of a desert without a single source of illumination. If it weren't for those bastards hovering in the distance, he would have been in an even better mood to appreciate the night sky than he was now. How many days has it been? Eugene wondered. It was about 4 days after he had passed through the final city's western gate. Usually when crossing a desert, normal people would never think of doing it alone. At the gate, which all foreigners needed to go through in order to leave the city, there were a lot of travelers looking for companions to cross the desert together. That way they could cooperate with each other or even form a temporary caravan. They could also collectively hire guides and escorts familiar with the desert. These were some of the safest ways to cross the desert, but Eugene didn't choose any of them. Instead, he decided to just cross the desert all by himself, and that was literally what he did. Without even riding a camel, he set out to cross the desert by relying solely on his own body. This was because Eugene had judged that walking on his own 2 feet would actually be faster than riding a camel. Back to the present, Eugene thought to himself, are they really thieves? That had been his first suspicion. But for thieves, their behavior was strange. They had been following behind Eugene since 2 days ago, but instead of attacking him to steal his belongings, they had just kept following Eugene's trail while maintaining a long distance between him and them. Identity cards are convenient, but at times like this, they sure are a fucking pain. 300 years ago, fake IDs were common. As long as you handed the guards a few pennies along with an identity badge you picked up from somewhere, you could easily pass through any gate you liked. However, in this day and age, since it was common for identification cards to be linked with your blood, it wasn't so easy to forge one's identity. Since it was so hard and things would just get annoying if he got caught, Eugene had decided to forego such an attempt. So who are they? Eugene had had no choice but to present his real ID at the city gate. He had also given quite a bit of money to the person in charge who had been on the verge of making a fuss about it. Eugene had thought that he'd managed to convince the guy with his threats and bribery to just keep quiet and let him through, but it looked like that damn bastard had just pocketed his money and then reported it to his superiors. That was probably why he now had a tail. Being a member of a prestigious family wasn't always a convenience. With a click of his tongue, Eugene took out his map. For the past 4 days since he had left Khajiitan, he had moved quite quickly. This body of his didn't tire easily, and his mana was also up to snuff. Thanks to that, he was able to move faster than he would have while riding a camel. If he kept up this pace, Eugene would arrive at his past life's hometown in 3 days at the very latest. But he had no intention of dragging this troublesome tale home with him. Eugene had left them alone for the past 2 days to better check their intentions, but since these guys were keeping quiet, it looked like he would need to make them speak up, even if that meant using force. I really am amazed whenever I see it. Isn't that guy cold? Layman clicked his tongue in astonishment as he lowered the telescope. They had been following Eugene at a distance for the past 2 days. But that boy from the Lionheart clan seemed to be so naive and ignorant that it was difficult to believe that he was a young master from a prestigious family. Eugene hadn't even brought an escort with him. Well, Layman had heard that the Lionheart clan was a famous martial clan and that the boy showed exceptional talent even among the other Lionhearts of his generation. Although he was born from a collateral line, he had been adopted into the main family due to some kind of bloodline continuation ceremony. Well, whatever. It wasn't like Layman really held an interest in all of that. No matter how amazing the Lionheart clan was, the person they were following was just a 19-year-old brat. And as rumors were usually just exaggerations of the truth, Layman was more afraid of failing his master's orders than he was of a young master from a distant foreign country. I think it might be some kind of a ritual, Layman's lieutenant speculated. A ritual? Layman repeated. The man continued. Didn't they say that he's almost reached the age where he's going to be regarded as an adult? Our tribe sends young men who are about to reach adulthood on a journey away from the tribe. What's so special about that? Our tribe's coming-of-age ceremony was also like that. Most of the tribes living in this desert have similar coming-of-age ceremonies. Layman replied with a snort of derision. So what? You think that boy is challenging the desert to prove that he's a man? If that's not the case, then what other reason could there be for such actions? He doesn't light any fires or pitch any tents and just keeps walking through the desert from morning to night, hunting whatever monsters he encounters. We've only been watching him for so long, but the boy's behavior does seem no different from a person going through one of our desert tribe's coming-of-age ceremonies. You're saying that someone from the Keel Empire's Lionheart clan would really come all the way to this desert just for a coming-of-age ceremony? I don't know his reasons, but remember what our master told us? He said we should not allow that boy to enter the Kazani desert. That was their master's only order. Although even Layman hadn't been made aware of the reasons for this order, Layman had no intention of rudely speculating about their master's order. Let's just get some sleep ourselves as well, Lamanna ordered. After all, that hard-working boy is sure to get back on the move early in the morning. It seems that the Lionheart clan really is amazing as they say it is. There's no way he could be familiar with the desert, but he's already able to walk so fast. Anyone looking at him would believe that he was born in the desert. Layman's talkative lieutenant couldn't finish what he was saying. As he turned to look behind Layman, his mouth fell wide open. Unable to understand why his lieutenant had such a shocked expression, Layman also turned his head to look. Then Layman's jaw also dropped just like his lieutenant's. For behind Layman was the approaching figure of Eugene Lionheart. While following Eugene for the past 2 days, they had quickly learned that the boy was able to travel incredibly fast, even though Eugene wasn't riding a camel, nor was he equipped for such a desert crossing. He only had one cloak, and his shoes were an ordinary pair that might be seen being worn just about anywhere, but even so, that boy was able to run across the sandy desert like his feet were stepping on hard, flat ground. And that was the case even now. Now, could such a speed really be called running? For a moment, Layman was forced to question what he was seeing. Since they hadn't wanted Eugene to notice that they were tracking him, Layman and his men had stayed at a good distance. Far enough away that they shouldn't have been able to be seen without using a telescope. They hadn't neglected to blend in with the terrain either. Even now, Layman and his men were keeping low behind the ridge of a sand dune. But even so, a pure white flame could be seen clearly weaving through the darkness. This was the first time he had seen it in person, but even Layman had heard all about that famous mana flame. It symbolized the Lionheart clan's white flame formula, the dazzlingly white lion's mane. "D'you get back?" Layman shouted the order. Their master hadn't given them orders to confront that boy, so it was best to withdraw. But how no, since when had that young man noticed them? Eugene was charging directly towards them at far too fast a speed. The reasonable distance that they had kept no longer seemed so reasonable. For now, Layman could only pull out his kukri from his side. Like I thought, they aren't assassins, Eugene decided upon seeing them. There were 2 particularly famous and powerful forces in Nahama: the sand shamans and the assassins. Looking at their level of stealth and clothing, Eugene's followers didn't seem like assassins. Judging by their clothes, they appeared no different from ordinary travelers attempting to cross the desert, but that was likely their disguise. Layman's face stiffened as he screamed, "Stop!" He realized that it was too late for them to retreat. The boy had approached faster than expected. Stop? Did he really just try to tell me what to do? Why should I? Eugene didn't respond to Layman's cry. He was curious to see who his followers were. He also wanted to know what they were scheming by following behind him like this. He might have been able to find out by greeting them with a smile and chatting about this and that, but Eugene hadn't even given any consideration to such a method in the first place. Something like that could actually work. Why would they try to follow him secretly? Layman gritted his teeth. He had clearly stated his demand, but the other side wasn't listening. Had they been mistaken for thieves? Since the other side was already attacking them, it was too late for them to try and resolve the misunderstanding through dialogue. Their master had told them to secretly follow the boy's trail. If they wanted to carry out his command properly, then instead of trying to resolve the confusion, it would be better to allow this confusion to continue. Let's just allow him to believe that we're thieves, Layman decided. They just needed to subdue the boy first, then they would steal a moderate amount of money and leave. This method wasn't the cleanest way to go about it, but perhaps this mugging would convince this boy to return the way he had come. To Layman, this didn't seem like such a bad outcome. If that boy had continued to head forwards without changing his direction tomorrow, then Layman would have had to intervene in some form anyway. Layman's mana covered his kukri in a gray sword force. Eugene's eyes lit up as he spotted this sight. Being able to create sword force, which was the next level up from sword light, meant that his opponent was a fairly skilled warrior. It's been quite a while, Eugene thought with anticipation. In the last 2 years, Eugene had spent most of his time breathing in the smell of ink rather than the scent of blood, and he had usually been holding a pen and paper instead of a sword or other weapons. As a result, his brain had been seeing a lot more use than his body. Although he had made sure to work out in the laboratories every day, he had spent much more time learning magic and working on his thesis. Moreover, while working out in the laboratories, Eugene was always on his own. While back at the Lionheart's main estate, he'd had Cyan, Gilead, Guion, and other knights to serve as his sparring partners. It had been 2 years since he last fought seriously with someone like this. Eugene felt delighted by this surprising realization. Learning magic had certainly been fun, but in both his previous life and his current one, Eugene found moving his body to be even greater fun. Layman had shown off his sword force, but he didn't take a swing. He had only taken out his sword in order to display a bit of a threat and get Eugene to stop. But soon Layman realized things weren't working out as he intended. That 19-year-old youth from the Lionheart clan was still charging at their group of 10, despite this being a desert with no one around to help him. Even on this dark night, and with Layman clearly displaying the existence of his sword force right in front of him, Eugene didn't show even a trace of fear. Instead, he seemed to be somehow amused as the corners of his mouth were lifted in a smile. Seeing this smile, Layman knew that he could no longer think of his opponent as a youth who had yet to experience his coming-of-age ceremony. This was definitely a young lion who had grown strong enough to lead his own pride. The cloak of darkness fluttered around Eugene's shoulders as he ran, covering his arms and making them difficult to see. As Layman shuffled backward, he raised his kukri a little higher. Boom! With a thundering clap from Eugene's cloak, a white light split apart the darkness. With a grunt, Layman swung his kukri. It wasn't just a half-hearted slash meant to act as a deterrent. Layman had instinctively felt that doing so wouldn't be safe, and he was soon proven correct. Ting! A silverish blue blade leaped out of Eugene's cloak and collided with Layman's kukri. Or at least, Layman had expected a collision. But he was wrong. Rather than an equal collision, he was struck with an overwhelming force. Layman's kukri was wrenched upward, and his wrists and arms were now throbbing with pain. Ugh! Layman quickly threw himself backward with a gasp. The clash was over in an instant, but his men were already moving. His lieutenant, who was slightly behind him, was already holding up his own kukri. The lieutenant quickly rushed forward to face Eugene in place of the retreating Layman. But as he was rushing forward, he suddenly froze. Because Eugene was now holding a loaded crossbow in his left hand. But when did Eugene get an opening to pull it out? Until just now, his left hand had been empty. As he slid down the sand dune, Eugene kept his crossbow raised. The lieutenant couldn't tear his gaze away from the bolt aimed precisely at his chest. He wouldn't have been so afraid if it had just been for the bolt. The lieutenant was a skilled warrior who could even catch an arrow when it was flying at him. However, he couldn't do anything about the sand beneath him suddenly swallowing his feet. A spell. There was no incantation. The spell had just activated suddenly. The lieutenant quickly attempted to pull himself free, but Eugene's spell didn't just stop at collapsing the ground beneath him. Led by mana, the sand formed into dozens of tentacles that wrapped around the lieutenant's legs. How dare you! Layman's other subordinates also charged forwards. Only then did Eugene loosen his crossbow. Whang! The lieutenant wasn't able to avoid the bolt. Fortunately, its had only pierced his shoulder, not his chest, but no matter where it had hit, getting shot by a crossbow bolt still hurt. Eugene hadn't just unleashed a crossbow bolt. Dozens of magic missiles also flashed through the darkness alongside it. It was only then that Eugene spoke up. "Who are you?" Layman wasn't able to respond immediately. Right now the only ones still standing on their feet were Eugene and Layman. Chapter 60. If he was just going to ask them that, why didn't he try talking to them first? What kind of thug would just assault them out of nowhere to get his questions answered? These questions ran through Layman's mind as he glared at Eugene. Although Layman was listening to these questions, he still didn't lower his guard. Layman wasn't able to spot any openings on Eugene as he stood there in a slightly crooked stance. Eugene had also been able to cross that long distance in an instant and had been able to knock back Layman's sword force with just a swing of his own sword from an unstable position. To top it off, Eugene had shown his skillful use of magic without any incantations. Taken together, it was unbelievable. Layman gulped nervously. Objectively speaking, Layman was an exceptional warrior. At least in this region there was no warrior better than Layman. But it was exactly because of this that Layman couldn't help but be wary. Layman shuffled backward in order to widen his field of view. This allowed him to observe the state of his defeated subordinates. Although no one had died, they weren't in good condition either. His men had gotten their bones broken by the magic missiles, and his lieutenant had a crossbow bolt stuck in one shoulder while being bound by tentacles of sand. "Aren't you going to answer me?" Even as Eugene impatiently asked such a question, the tentacles of sand didn't disappear. Dozens of magic missiles were also still hovering above Layman's fallen subordinates. How was Eugene able to wield a sword even as he maintained multiple spells? And all while showing not a single opening? Layman may not have learned any magic, but even he knew that what Eugene was doing currently required an impossible level of skill for a 19-year-old. "We're thieves," Layman eventually confessed. "It seems that Nahama is quite the powerful country." Eugene scoffed as the corners of his mouth twisted up in a wry grin. After all, the leader of a group of measly bandits with less than 10 members is actually able to give off sword force from his blade. If a bandit group of this size is at that level, that must mean a gang of bandits with more than 100 people will have at least 10 men who can exert sword force. Layman stayed silent. Eugene continued, "And how strong must the soldiers be to be able to suppress such bandits? It's quite amazing. If they have that kind of military power, won't Nahama be able to unify the continent?" Layman tried to come up with an excuse, as thieves were just a little special. "Hey old man. I'm telling you, stop with your bullshit and just speak honestly," Eugene said with a snicker. Having said this, Eugene confidently strode forward, but Layman couldn't retreat any further. "Truth is, I don't really need you to answer me. You can keep silent if you like. Because I have my own ways of making you talk," Eugene menaced. Was this really a young master of the prestigious Lionheart clan? Although his face was that of a youth's, the words spilling from his mouth sounded like they could have come from the type of mercenary one would find at a pub. On top of that, there was Eugene's gaze. It was blatantly exuding killing intent. How was it possible for a flower grown in a greenhouse to give off a killing intent like that? "Just who the hell are you?" Although Layman knew this was a strange question, he couldn't help but feel the need to ask it. "I don't know what you mean by that," Eugene responded. "You should have known who I was before you started following me. Isn't that right?" "You're Eugene Lionheart," Layman finally admitted. Eugene confirmed, "That's right, it seems you're well aware of my identity. But are you really Eugene Lionheart? If not, then who else could I be?" As Eugene spat out these words, he kicked off the ground. The sand from the dune burst up and exploded in all directions. But there was no way that Layman could lose sight of Eugene's figure even in the countless grains of sand. Or at least that was what he thought. Eugene's figure disappeared in an instant. Such a movement was impossible with just speed alone. Layman's senses didn't miss. Layman couldn't be sure of it from only their first clash, but now he was certain of his suspicion. For Eugene's mana to not be scattered when his sword collided with Layman's own blade of sword force could only mean that Eugene was using sword force as well. There was no time for Layman to be astonished by this fact. He still needed to pay attention to other things even with Eugene right in front of him. Layman felt a chill running down his back as a magic missile that had been hidden in the cloud of sand flew towards his blind spot. Magic missile was only a first circle spell. It was a spell that just about anyone who called themselves a wizard could use, but even when their circles increased, most still favored magic missile as an attack spell due to its ease of use. Magic missiles could be cast with just a small amount of mana, and their trajectory could be changed at will depending on their caster's mana control. And mana control was something that Eugene had been skilled in ever since his previous life. Eugene's mind was capable of guiding each projectile individually, and the ring flame formula amplified the power of every projectile. Layman couldn't afford to ignore such an attack. Mana burst out from Layman's core. Grayish-white mana wrapped around his body. This was a mana shield. Since it was just a technique meant to coat someone's body with the mana that they possessed, the use of this defensive technique wasn't differentiated between a wizard and a warrior. But its defensive power varied greatly depending on the user's level of strength. Usually, a mana shield constructed by a warrior of Layman's level should be able to laugh off a blow from a first circle offensive spell. However, Layman's body shook as he felt a heavy shockwave coming from behind him. As Layman was forced to stagger forwards, Eugene's sword pierced through the opening this had created. Ugh. At first, Layman thought that he'd been cut. But he wasn't. Eugene's sword just lightly grazed the surface of the mana shield that Lamana had erected. It had to have been deliberate. Eugene had purposely held back. Layman's eyes widened in anger. "How dare you insult me?" Layman roared and violently swung his kukri. Each time his kukri, which was curved in the shape of a crescent moon, sliced through the air, it created a distinctive whooshing noise. Although Layman swung his kukri like this dozens of times, he wasn't able to make any contact with Eugene. Just by shuffling his feet slightly, Eugene could easily evade Layman's blade. Usually there was no way that Layman would grow tired just from swinging his sword like this. However, Layman's breathing was gradually getting heavier and heavier. It was because of the mounting pressure. Even when he swung his sword with all his might, Layman still couldn't hit Eugene, and the youth from the Lionheart clan was no longer smiling like he was before. His calm eyes weren't showing any traces of agitation. Even in the face of slashes that could cost him his life with just a touch, Eugene was still able to stay so calm. All of this was putting pressure on Layman. On top of that, it wasn't just Eugene that he needed to pay attention to. Layman didn't know when another spell might come flying at his back. He could also be sucked into the ground like his lieutenant. Or something might even fall on his head from above. The range of Layman's guard needed to be increased for each variety of attacks that Eugene had shown. This limited what actions Layman was capable of. He couldn't afford to take risks. Just as Layman was on the verge of panting for breath, Eugene jokingly offered, "How about I don't use magic?" These words caused the hair on Layman's head to stand up in rage. This was the first time he had ever been so insulted. "Caw!" Layman burst out in a shrill cry. The sword force wrapped around his kukri intensified in strength. He was going to kill Eugene. Although Layman's master hadn't ordered him to do so, his warrior's pride that had been insulted was more important than his master's orders. "Now things are looking up," Eugene smirked to himself. Not only had it been a few years since he'd used his body like this, but this was also the first time for Eugene's reincarnated body to face an opponent who could output his sword force like this. Whenever he sparred with Gilead, Guion and the other knights of the main estate, they didn't use sword light or sword force for fear of possible injuries. As such, Eugene wanted to see what this man could do. This old guy facing him had been too cautious in his attacks after claiming he was a thief. With toothless blows like those, no matter how much Layman swung his sword, Eugene would suffer flesh wounds at most. Now though there was some weight to Layman's blows. Smirking, Eugene swung his shoulders and his arms shook as he sprang into action. Bam bam bam. Grains of sand were sent flying with each step Layman was forced to take back, and drops of blood dripping from his cuts mixed in with the sand. Even though he was seeing it personally, Layman still couldn't believe what was happening to his body. "These cuts," Layman winced. "How many times has it been?" Layman's whole body was stinging in pain. The cuts weren't deep, only skin deep at most. Neither his bones nor his muscles had been broken by these blows. Was it a miracle that they were all shallow? No, the truth was Eugene was holding back on him. Layman's beard trembled in agitation. Kia! Layman roared once more and charged at Eugene. However, the results of this attempt weren't much different from those that had come before. By the time Layman had finished taking a step forward, WNYD had already made dozens of slashes. Eugene's sword was unbelievably quick. But the even more alarming thing was that none of the cuts made by his sword overlapped. This meant that the youth wasn't just swinging his sword haphazardly. He knew exactly where his sword was going and where each of his blows would land. The intensity of his mana, his magic, and even his swordsmanship. How on earth does someone like this exist? Layman thought resentfully, cursing the heavens for their unfairness. As blood poured down his body, Layman rushed at Eugene once more. Eugene just snorted at Layman's show of bravery. Qua! A cloud of sand was sent flying with a boom, and Layman was left panting in the middle of the aftermath. He had squeezed out the last of his sword force in a single instant, erupting into a large explosion. However, even with this he hadn't been able to touch Eugene. Don't you need to take care of your subordinates? Eugene chided him. The voice was coming from behind him. As Layman felt a chill run down his spine, he spun around to look back. Layman saw his lieutenant and the other soldiers under his command floating in the air. Eugene casually threw them aside and tucked W80 into his cloak. What do you think you're doing? Layman gasped out. Can't you tell just by looking at it? I'm putting away my sword, Eugene stated the obvious. I still haven't been defeated, Layman insisted. Eugene shrugged. I know. Pop pop pop. Eugene cracked his knuckles as he walked over to Layman. So I'm going to defeat you now, Eugene declared. Caw! Layman rushed at him with another scream. Eugene ducked under the slash that flew at him and clenched his fist. Pow! A fist covered in mana crashed through Layman's mana shield and drove into his side. Cag! Layman's breath was driven out of him, but the assault didn't stop there. Eugene skillfully swayed his body backward and then, for the sake of fairness, slammed his fist into Layman's other side as well. A blow to Layman's stomach came after that one. When Layman staggered, unable to endure the pain, Eugene immediately swung his leg and kicked the outside of Layman's thigh. Eugene wouldn't allow Layman to fall with just that. He grabbed Layman by the collar and held him up. Then he swung his fist up into Layman's jaw twice. When Layman was about to vomit, Eugene slammed his chin upwards, preventing Layman from opening his mouth. Layman choked. Gaw! Layman felt himself losing consciousness, but he was still holding on to his kukri. He tried to swing his kukri to somehow change this situation, but it didn't work out. Eugene just grabbed Layman's wrist and twisted it. Then with his other hand he grabbed Layman's head. Using his sword first and then putting it away. This wasn't because Eugene had the intention of sparing Layman. It was all to show off a blatant disregard for Layman as a threat and thus break his will. Eugene was demonstrating that he could crush someone like Layman with just his bare hands. Having seen the truth of this, Layman's will was immediately broken. Compared to being sliced dozens of times with the sword, being beaten up by the fists of a 19-year-old youth was much more painful and depressing. Hold on is what Layman wanted to say. But Eugene didn't bother to allow Layman to finish. Bang! Layman's head was spiked into the sand. Since the ground wasn't that hard, Eugene didn't have to worry about cracking Layman's head in two. I still don't know who's behind these guys, Eugene reminded himself. The situation was different from when Eugene had dealt with the Black Wizard in Arath. This was a foreign country, a place where Eugene didn't even have Lovelian to look out for him. If the one behind this old guy was at the very least a noble of Nahama, this might turn into a political fiasco. He didn't want to put any more wrinkles onto Gilead's already troubled and worn-out face. That said, Eugene wasn't going to be excessively merciful either. Bang bang bang. Eugene slammed Layman's head into the sand a few more times. Layman's already broken will was utterly crushed. With the bitter taste of the sand entering his eyes, nose and lips, Layman's tears and blood turned the sand into mud. Layman stammered, "Stop." Layman knew that he was really going to die. And he wasn't going to die fighting with honor but instead be left dead in a barren patch of the desert while pretending to be a thief. The realization of this was terrible and so was the pain he was in. In a shaking voice, Layman could barely spit out this plea for mercy. and only then did Eugene's hands pause in their place. Who are you? Eugene asked once more. Layman tried to speak. I am. The moment Layman hesitated while replying, Eugene slammed Layman's head into the ground once more. Your response was late, Eugene explained. If I ask you something, answer me right away. It's also fine if you answer me before I even ask. What did Eugene even mean by saying it was okay for Layman to answer before being asked the question? Although this thought went through Layman's head, he didn't voice his protest. Instead he confessed, My name is Layman Schulhoff. Huh? What's with your tone, you motherfucker, Eugene cursed. Bang. Layman's head crashed into the ground once more. He repeated, My name is Layman Schulhoff, sir. Bang. Layman pleaded, just what is it you want to hear from me? Eugene raised an eyebrow, forgetting the sir again? This motherfucker. Bang. A cry came from elsewhere, please stop. Having seen his superior thrown around like this several times, the lieutenant, who was still suspended in the air, twisted his body to face them and pleaded with Eugene. As blood trickled down from his nose and mouth, Layman looked up at his lieutenant. The lieutenant stammered, Our master is Tyree Almadani. Bang. Even though the lieutenant was the one who answered the question, Layman's head was still smashed into the ground once more. In that brief moment, Eugene had understood the relationship between Layman and his lieutenant. He realized that this upright old man would really refuse to tell him anything no matter how many times he was hit. Bang. And who is that? Eugene asked even as he slammed Layman into the ground once more. Eugene's gaze wasn't aimed at Layman but instead at the lieutenant. But Layman was the one to respond to his question in a dizzied voice. Don't tell him anything. Not listening to Layman's order, the lieutenant revealed, Our master. Tyree Almadani is the emir of Khajitan. Rather than his master who was far away, the lieutenant was more afraid of the one who kept slamming Layman's head into the dirt right in front of him, Eugene. Eugene recalled that Khajitan was the city right on the western border of Nahama, which Eugene had just left. This meant that Layman was a subordinate of the Lord of Khajitan. Bang. The lieutenant continued stammering, Our master. He wanted us to. Hurry up, you motherfucker, Eugene urged. Bang. He wanted us to secretly follow you. Sir Eugene. Bang. I'm not sure of his reasons. But. Bang. Please just let go of the captain's head. I can't give you a detailed reason. But. Bang. He told us not to allow you to enter the Kazani desert. Only then did Eugene stop pounding Layman's head into the ground. Why? He asked simply. I'm not really sure. Bang. No, really. Bang. It's the truth. Really, I swear that I've told you everything that I know. I truly don't know his reasons for this. Truly, the lieutenant pleaded as tears poured down his cheeks. After eyeing him for a few moments, Eugene snorted and released Layman's head. That said, he wasn't just going to allow Layman to go free. Eugene plopped his butt down on Layman's back as he sat and stroked his chin. Kavani. That was the name of the desert that Eugene would enter if he kept going in this direction. It was also the location of Eugene's hometown. 300 years ago, the frontier of Taraz had been in the middle of what was now the Kazani Desert. Why doesn't he want me to enter? Eugene pondered. The lieutenant answered, He didn't say anything about that. There usually isn't anything to see in a desert. Kazani, no beast or monster even lives there. There aren't any oases either. This was only natural. The Kazani Desert had only been created recently as the epicenter of the sandstorm that was gnawing at Taraz's territory. It didn't have an oasis and rain only fell rarely. Kazani was a harsh land that no one could live off. It wasn't like there hadn't been any attempts to make this wide desert livable. Just a few decades ago, an artificial oasis was created in Kazani with a village surrounding it. However, a sandstorm had suddenly engulfed the oasis and the village, and after this had happened several times, Kazani had been abandoned as an uninhabitable wasteland. Could it be the headquarters of the sand shamans? That was Eugene's first thought. But although it was obvious that Nahama was using the desertification to gnaw away at Taraz, that didn't explain why they would want to keep the young master from the prestigious Lionheart clan from entering Kazani. Or could Amelia Merwin be? In Nahama, the one that Eugene was the wariest of was Amelia Merwin. The black wizard who had signed a contract with the Demon King of Incarceration and who was being supported by Nahama. Not only did she have a bad personality, but Amelia Maroon also had as much power as a natural disaster, so even Nahama treated her with caution. It was strictly forbidden for tourists as well as the citizens of Nahama to enter the Ashur Desert, which was where her dungeon was located. The Ashur Desert was a long way from here and there was no reason for Eugene to go there. It was also far away from where Anise had last been sighted. Eugene organized his thoughts. Raising his head, he looked around at Layman's subordinates who were sunken into the sand. They hadn't just stayed still while Layman was getting thrashed. They had tried to attack Eugene several times, so Eugene had used magic to bury them in the sand until only their heads were sticking out. "You all can go back," Eugene said with a wave of his hand, then he tapped the top of Layman's head. "But you'll be coming with me." "Ha!" Layman grunted. Eugene pointed out, "No matter what, you can't allow me to enter the Kazani Desert, right? I don't really care about that, but it would be annoying if I get into a pointless argument by going there." "What does that have to do with me going with you?" Layman groaned. "If someone does make a fuss about it, I'll just blame you," Eugene explained. Layman was struck dumb. "You get what I'm saying, right? I'll use you and thus your own master as a shield. You said that your master is the Emir of Khajitan, right? Doesn't that mean I can silence any annoying protests by using his name?" "Yes. Or would you rather die to me here? Of course, your subordinates will be dying along with you. Or else you could just return to your master, tell him that you failed to follow me and that you were beaten to the brink of death. Of course, I have no reason to keep quiet about this. Didn't you call yourself thieves when we first met? I'll tell everyone that the Emir of Khajitan disguised his subordinates as thieves to steal the Lionheart's treasures. How about that?" "Tuts. We never intended to do something like. Who do you think they'll believe, your words or mine? For now, what's certain is this. The Lionheart clan will definitely believe my side of the story. After all, I do have things that are valuable enough to tempt you to steal them." With a grin, Eugene pulled out Wmoid's hilt from inside his cloak and showed it to them. "You know what this is, right?" Eugene asked. "It's Wmoid, the storm sword used by the Great Vermouth, the ancestor of our Lionheart clan. It's an item that just about anybody would covet. Or at least that's what most people would think, no? So they're sure to believe that the Emir of Khajitan pulled something so devious because he lusted for W." Unable to say anything, Layman could only purse his lips. Although the length of time that Layman had suffered under Eugene was brief, he couldn't treat Eugene's words as a mere threat. What if Eugene really went around saying something like that? Layman's head would be sent flying, and perhaps so would his subordinates. Even his master Tyree al-Madani might lose his head if things went wrong. Understood, Layman had no choice but to concede. Chapter 61. Although Layman's subordinates dreaded the thought of returning without him, they had no choice but to do so. Before they left, they straightened out their stories about what had happened here. During their covert pursuit, Eugene Lionheart had attempted to enter the Kazani Desert, forcing them to try and stop him. However, it had been impossible for them to stand firm in the face of the stubbornness from this young master from the Lionheart clan, and they had also failed to persuade him. As such, their captain Layman had decided to accompany Eugene alone. For now, they allowed Eugene to enter the Kazani Desert as long as he promised to turn back at the first sign of danger or trouble. None of them could be sure that Tyree al-Mandani, the Emir of Khajitan, would accept such a story. The wounds that they had received from Eugene had been treated somehow with potions and healing magic, but in the end their master's orders had been to prevent Eugene from entering Kazani, not to act as an escort and go with him if they weren't able to deter him. Thanks to this, Layman was so unsettled that he couldn't help but stay up all night long. After admitting to himself that even if his subordinates hadn't spoken up for him, he wouldn't have been able to stand the fear and pain that Eugene had brought him for much longer, Layman felt greatly ashamed of himself. Owing your loyalty to your master and having tight lips were important virtues for a warrior. But Layman had betrayed his master. His lips, which should have been as tight as a lock, had flapped freely. He was also concerned about how his subordinates, who had been left with no choice but to return, would be treated. However, this was for the best. Although dying at Eugene's hands was certainly a scary thought, Layman was more afraid that both his and his master's honor would be tarnished because of this failure of his. He tried to comfort himself with the thought that he was protecting their honor by following Eugene, but Layman's heart still couldn't rest easy. On top of that, Layman couldn't sleep because of all the slices and bruises that Eugene had inflicted upon his body, especially his face, which had been repeatedly smashed into the sand. On the other hand, Eugene was having a good night's sleep. While Layman was tortured throughout the night with pain in both his body and heart, Eugene was sleeping like a baby some distance away, wrapped up in his cloak of darkness. Layman looked over to Eugene and clicked his tongue in dumbfounded shock. Although he had been beaten up, Layman's limbs were still intact. His hands and feet hadn't been tied up, and neither had Layman had his weapons taken from him. If he could only muster up the confidence, Layman could have attacked Eugene whenever he pleased. Is he just that arrogant? No, it can't be. Layman rejected such an idea. Eugene wasn't tossing and turning, nor was he snoring. He seemed to be deep asleep, breathing slowly with a calm look on his face. Even so, Layman still didn't dare to get close to him. In that short time, the violence his body had been subjected to had broken Layman's will to resist. Also, Layman still couldn't see any openings in Eugene. Eugene was definitely asleep. Whether it was his breathing or his pulse, all the signs indicated that he was in slumber. Could he be faking his sleep? But what reasons would Eugene have for doing so? Layman's defeat was by no means accidental. He had been thoroughly defeated by that 19-year-old boy from the Lionheart clan. It wasn't just a lucky shot. Layman's defeat was the natural result of the overwhelming gap in skill between him and Eugene. Could it just be a habit? Layman speculated. Layman guessed that Eugene was so accustomed to danger that he could fall asleep deeply even when he didn't know where the danger was coming from or what form it might take. While his mind might be fast asleep, his body was ready to respond to any threat. Layman wondered if he should try and test his guess, but then he recalled that he lacked the skills to do so. With a snort of derision, Layman just continued covering his body in bandages. In the first place, calling it a mere test would be ridiculous when he was risking getting his throat cut. It was pointless to get anywhere near Eugene. "Shall we get moving?" Eugene suggested. Mornings came early in the desert. Eugene had immediately gotten up as soon as the rays of dawn began spreading across the sky. Even though he had just woken up, his eyes were unbelievably clear and bright. "All right," Layman reluctantly agreed. In the end, Layman hadn't been able to get even a wink of sleep. Even so, he didn't show any fatigue. Layman was also accustomed to harsh conditions. As a warrior who could skillfully control his mana, he could recover from his fatigue with a handful of mana even if he went without any sleep. "Could it be that you're in a bad mood because I treated you so rudely?" Eugene questioned him. "Not at all," Layman denied. Eugene continued prodding. "Then are you upset because I trampled all over your honor?" "Not at all," came Layman's delayed reply. "Your first reply was quick, but the one just now was slightly slower. It's fine if you are upset. I said what I did because I wanted to upset you, and that's why I beat you up as well," Eugene admitted as he started walking ahead, patting the sand off his cloak. "But that was yesterday's business. Since the night has passed and the sun has risen on a new morning, let's just start the new day with a new frame of mind." Layman wasn't sure what this bastard intended by saying such things. Eugene changed the subject. "Are there any sand shamans in the Kazani desert?" Amid Layman's confusion, another question had arrived. Layman couldn't think of a reply immediately and just stared silently at Eugene's back. "Don't act like you don't know," warned Eugene. I truly don't know," Layman stammered. Eugene threatened him. "Do you really want to spend some more time in hell at my hands?" "No way. I really truly don't know. I'll swear this on everything that I have," Layman insisted. Layman was being sincere. And why was Eugene asking if there were any sand shamans in the Kazani desert? Why would the sand shamans who had sworn sole loyalty to the royal family of Nahama be in the Kazani desert, which was so far away from the capital? "What's your rank?" Eugene suddenly asked. "Huh." Layman sounded confused. "You said that your master is the Emir of Kajitan. Since you even had subordinates with you, you must have some kind of military rank," Eugene clarified. "I'm the commander of the 2nd Division of the Red Sand Warriors, a unit under the direct command of my master," Layman revealed. A unit under the Emir's direct command. This was no different from a knightly order serving under a noble. This meant that being the captain of the 2nd Division had to be a fairly prestigious position. With the skills that Layman had shown yesterday, the position of captain wasn't wasted on him. Eugene turned his head around to scan Layman's face. What he saw there was just shame and fear. It didn't feel like Layman was lying to him. Eugene now knew why someone like Layman, who had already reached the rank of captain, had been sent on a mission like this. Layman was both honest and loyal. However, loyalty could never be an absolute guarantee. Meanwhile, ignorance could always be relied upon. No matter how much you terrified, intimidated, and tortured someone, they couldn't blab about what they didn't know. In that respect, Layman was the perfect patsy. Eugene sighed. "Are you an idiot, old man?" "Huh?" Layman was perplexed by the sudden insult. The Kazani Desert. It used to be the territory of the Kingdom of Taraz, right? Eugene prompted. Why on earth would you bring up something so ancient? It's true that it was the territory of Taraz around 100 years ago. Layman played along with Eugene. That's right. But a sandstorm appeared out of nowhere and turned all the fine land and forests into a desert. Since the rest of their border with Nahama also turned into a desert, Taraz had no choice but to cede this territory to Nahama. Although Eugene called it a cession, it was basically extortion. While claiming that the spread of the desert had been mandated by heaven, the Sultan of Nahama stationed his warriors in the desert and began conducting military exercises. As a small country, Taraz definitely couldn't risk a dispute with Nahama, and no righteous country on this continent would shed the blood of its soldiers just because it felt pity for such a small country. The desertification is still gradually progressing even now, isn't that right? Since your guys can't pull off such rubbish against the Keel Empire, you just keep beating down on the pushovers in Taraz. There was a clear tone of accusation in Eugene's voice. Don't you dare spread such nonsense, Layman warned Eugene. Unlike your appearance, it seems that you're rather naive, old man. Or could you just be pretending to be naive? Eugene asked. In an uncertain tone, Layman argued, even if what you say is true, there's no way our master could be involved in such despicable actions. Weren't your orders to conceal your identities and follow me around rather despicable? That's... He was just worried that you might run into danger in such a treacherous desert. It looks like you really don't know anything. Well, that's fine. Since it's not like it's important whether or not you're aware of the truth. Eugene shook his head as he said this and turned to face forward. But you should get one thing straight. I have no intention of coming all this way to a foreign country just to get mixed up in a conflict that I can't handle, got it? I can roughly guess why your master wouldn't want me to head into the desert. If a foreigner wanders into the base of the Sand Shamans, and if that foreigner happens to be the young master of the Lionheart clan, wouldn't that just be a pain in the ass for everyone involved? If Eugene was just some guy, then they could get rid of him without any concern. It wasn't uncommon for travelers to go missing in this vast desert. However, the disappearance of the Lionheart clan's young master would hold much different weight. If Eugene were to go missing in the desert, Gilead, the patriarch of the clan, would never just let this issue rest. I believe that I understand what you're trying to say, Layman replied as he lowered his gaze. If there really are sand shamans in there like you speculated, then before they can harm you I will step in to protect you, my lord. Even if the sand shamans are directly under the Sultan's command, they should at least show some respect for my master, the Emir of Khajitan. It would be nice if that were the case, Eugene said without any confidence. But my lord, why do you want to go to the Kazani Desert? Layman hesitantly asked. There really is nothing to be found there. That's something I'll need to confirm with my own eyes, Eugene stated firmly. Eugene wasn't sure if he could really find Hamel's grave in the desert. To a certain extent, this was all just supposition. It could be that there was nothing to be found there after all. But that said, he still felt the need to check it. Without saying anything more, Eugene started running across the desert. He's so fast, Layman exclaimed to himself as he immediately began following Eugene. Although Layman had been beaten black and blue last night, fortunately, none of his bones had been broken. Thanks to him circulating his mana instead of sleeping, Layman wouldn't have any problems keeping up, even if they were running. Though that should have been the case, it still proved difficult for Layman. While it didn't seem like Eugene was running particularly vigorously with each step he took, his body was sent flying across the sand. Layman still had time to wonder to himself. Could the sandstorms really be the work of the sand shamans? As a warrior, Layman didn't consider invading other countries to be an evil deed. After all, there was nothing wrong with the strong taking from the weak. This wasn't just a law of the desert. Everything in this world ran on the survival of the fittest. But to use a sandstorm as their means of invasion, wasn't something like that truly despicable? Layman felt that if there was going to be war, then it was only right that it should be a real war where warriors shed their own blood for victory. But what if the great Sultan was just showing that he valued and cherished the blood of his warriors? If he was indeed saving their blood from being shed until the day of their great war for conquest by doing this, then his soldiers should just prepare for the war with feelings of both joy and gratitude. This was all that a warrior could wish for. But it looked like Layman Shulhov wasn't truly a warrior, as he could feel a treasonous emotion beginning to wriggle in the depths of his heart. Layman tried to ignore this feeling. An oasis? Layman gasped. A day had passed since Layman had started accompanying Eugene, and they had entered the Kazani desert. Just as Layman and his lieutenant had said, the desert was barren and completely empty. It was a desert where nothing could survive. But that seemed to be all there was to it, as they hadn't encountered any particular dangers during the half a day they had spent in this desert. Then they had abruptly spotted an oasis. Layman stared at the distant oasis with a look of disbelief. The Kazani desert had no oases. That was why nothing could survive there, and Layman couldn't be more familiar with these facts. But for them to have discovered an oasis, could a terrible sandstorm have churned up the ground, freeing the water below? Or had the rain fallen here unnoticed and collected on the ground? Either way, Layman felt that the oasis they had spotted in the distance had to be a miracle of the desert. It's fake. While Layman was looking at the oasis with ecstatic eyes, Eugene spat out these words in a cold tone. Layman was bemused. Huh? I said that it's fake, Eugene repeated himself. Are you saying that it's a mirage? Layman asked. If you see a mirage of an oasis, it means there must be a real oasis somewhere in the distance. But not in this case. That's a magical illusion. Eugene was certain of this. He had gotten the feeling that from that point onwards, the density of mana was different from the surrounding area. But Layman hadn't been able to identify this as illusion magic like Eugene had. This was because his sensitivity towards mana was far lower than Eugene's, and he didn't have the same deep understanding of magic that Eugene did. So that's how they do it, Eugene nodded with a laugh. By showing us a mirage, they're trying to make us think that we're heading in the wrong direction, thus discouraging us from getting closer. But that just makes it even more suspicious. Layman was slow to react. You're saying that's a spell? That's impossible. Hey Layman. Try to keep your attempts to escape reality inside your own head. Don't piss me off by pointlessly spouting your weak attempts at denial, Eugene warned him. Layman bit his lip in silence. It's admirable that you're showing loyalty to your master, but it's not like your master is my master as well, right? Please don't insult my master. When did I ever accuse your master of being a son of a bitch? What do you mean by saying that I insulted him? Why are people so sensitive to such things nowadays? They keep making up insults from nothing. What was with Eugene saying things nowadays? Setting that thought aside, Layman forcefully relaxed his shoulders and lowered his gaze. If that's really illusion magic, what should we do now? It would be dangerous for us to try and deter around it, so since they've gone so far as to cast such a spell to deter us, why don't we just go back the way we came? Layman weakly suggested. I'll need to take a closer look before deciding what to do. Saying this with a grin, Eugene started walking towards the distant oasis. Layman protested, didn't you just say it's an illusion? So why do we have to go there? To see if they really are trying to send people to a safe place by making them turn back the way they came? Huh. For travelers in the desert, an oasis is an extremely precious sight. To the extent where they would feel the need to make a stop there once they've seen it. It can't be. Do you think that they might have an ambush lying in wait? Shouldn't that probably be the case? If it were me, that's what I would do. Rather than deter an intruder who might still come barging in from who knows where, it's overwhelmingly more convenient and efficient to slit their throats after reeling them in. Layman looked at Eugene with shaking eyes. Although logically speaking, Eugene's words were correct, it was hard to believe that such a judgment had come from a 19-year-old boy. Layman hesitated. If that really is the case, then why even risk the danger? Isn't it better to confirm your suspicions? As he replied, Eugene pulled out his map from his cloak. If Eugene wanted to head directly to where his hometown used to be 300 years ago, he needed to pass straight through that oasis. However, was it possible that someone might have left a trap here knowing that was the case? 300 years ago, Hamel had been the type of person who would just go ahead and check it out himself if he suspected a trap was in front of him. Hamel hadn't considered such actions to be reckless. Since he was sure he could handle whatever it threw at him, why not risk triggering the trap? So what if there really was a trap? He could just smash right through it. And if there wasn't a trap? Then he could just head on through with a more relaxed mindset than before. Eugene would actually prefer it if the oasis was a trap. He hoped that someone really was there waiting to ambush them. If that was the case, that would make it a little easier for him to plan for future situations. Could also confirm that his grave was somewhere in this desert. Currently, the presence of Nahama's sand shamans was just a suspicion on his part. But the fact that the oasis in front of him was an illusion cast by magic titled Eugene's suspicions over to certainty. If that really was a trap meant to bury any travelers in this desert and not guide them back to a safer location, then that just confirms it. And if it wasn't, then he would just have to make another decision at that time. Whether to just continue exploring all by himself to find the unknown location of his grave, or if he should properly seek permission for a full expedition. The Emir of Kajitan and Layman Shulhov, the commander of the 2nd Division of the Emir's personal guard. With those two behind me, that's at least a little insurance. And if that doesn't work, I can also use the Lionheart name as additional insurance, Eugene planned. If his attackers just chose to ignore all of that, that just meant that there was something over there important enough to risk turning the Lionheart clan into an enemy. So what could it be? His thoughts turned to the rumors that there would soon be a war. But is that really something that Nahama itself has decided on? Amelia Merwin was based in Nahama, a black wizard who had signed a personal contract with the Demon King of Incarceration. It was a well-known fact that she represented a huge proportion of Nahama's military strength. If Nahama truly was preparing for a war, was that because the war was what Helmuth had decided upon? Or was Nahama just concealing a growing ambition beneath Helmuth's gaze? This was a question that he couldn't answer. However, Eugene couldn't just ignore his suspicion that the Demon Kings and Helmuth might be involved in all of this. He couldn't risk ignoring the possibility. Eugene cursed. Fucking hell, why is it so difficult just to find a grave? A grave? Are you here because you wanted to visit the grave of a family member? Layman asked. Eugene grunted in acknowledgement. How could that? Why didn't you just tell me this earlier? Layman asked exasperatedly. Eugene returned his question. And what would you have done if I did? There's an area allocated separately as a cemetery in Kazani, Layman explained. I could have just led you right there. It's not in a cemetery. The grave I'm looking for should be all on its own. Then I'm not sure what kind of grave you're looking for, but there must be hundreds of thousands of corpses buried in this vast desert. That's probably true. Are you a native of Kazani? Eugene suddenly spat out this question without turning to look back at Layman. For a moment, Layman didn't know what to say and just pursed his lips. Eugene listed his observations. There's the way your eyes lit up when you looked at that oasis earlier. There's also the fact that you keep flinching during the regular sandstorms. Also, your mood shifted when I told you about the sand shamans. Layman appeared reluctant to speak. But Eugene didn't need him to say anything. Were you part of the group who tried to settle in the desert? So you were lucky enough to survive the disastrous sandstorm and somehow managed to reach Kajitan. Was it your master who allowed you in? So that's why you don't want to believe that your master is connected to the sandstorms, but I'm sure you're starting to have some doubts about it. Layman's silence confirmed Eugene's conclusion. Hey Layman. Let me give you a piece of advice, Eugene offered. With the way that the world works, most of the things that we don't want to believe are true turn out to be correct. And among those, it's especially the suspicions of someone secretly being an absolute shithead that turns out to have been the truth. Layman ground his teeth. Eugene continued, although you might indeed owe a great debt of gratitude to your master, it should also be true that your master knows about the origin of the sandstorms. What Tyree Almadani never expected was the fact that I was strong enough to beat both you and your subordinates with ease. He also didn't know I would be stubborn enough to head into Kazani anyway, ignoring all the threats and warnings. There's no way that's the case. Layman couldn't stay silent any longer. Didn't I tell you to keep your attempts at escapism inside your head? Well, do whatever you want. It's up to you to decide what you want to believe. Saying this with a snicker, Eugene continued to walk forward. At that moment, Layman's expression suddenly changed. He kicked off the ground and charged at Eugene's back. It's dangerous. Layman wasn't attacking Eugene. With a fearful cry, Layman pushed Eugene's back as a dark blade erupted from the sand beneath Eugene's feet. But Layman's hands weren't able to move Eugene's firm back. Then Eugene jumped straight up and spun around in midair. "Do you really think I would miss something that you had noticed?" As Eugene grumbled, he summoned some wind spirits. Boom! The sand covering the ground was blown away by a strong force of the wind. 1. The Korean version of this idiom is lips as heavy as a rock, which means someone is able to keep a secret. Chapter 62. Gales were mid-level wind spirits. If sylphs were able to raise a breeze, then gales were able to raise strong winds. Although there wasn't even a single breath of wind currently blowing in the desert, the moment that the gale was summoned, a strong breeze stirred up the sandy ground. No, it didn't just stop at stirring up the sand. Eugene's power amplified the gale's strength, creating a burst of wind that sounded like an explosion had gone off. All the surrounding sand erupted instantly, and Layman, who had been trying to push Eugene, was also sent flying head over heels. "Whoa!" Layman cried out in panic, but Eugene just stared down at the ground while floating in midair. Deep beneath the cracked surface of the sand, a man with a mask covering his whole head was writhing in pain. His mask was dyed a dark color, but the areas around his ears looked especially dark because of the blood that had burst from his ears due to the sudden explosion. Eugene recognized him. "He's from the assassins. There was never just one of them." Eugene's eyes quickly swept his surroundings. In the spaces where the wind wasn't able to blow, he could sense the swept-up sand deviating slightly. Eugene's mind reached out to the gale. The formless wind cried out a roar as it churned with even more ferocity. Whoosh 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 whoosh. Now that the whole area was obscured in a veil of billowing sand, Eugene decided to cast some spells. "It's nice to have a lot of options on what to use," he mused to himself. A dozen mounds of sands erupted once more with explosions. The sand that had been sent flying by these explosions blew at the assassins who had been waiting in ambush. They quickly raised their mana shields and tried to throw themselves out of range, but it was impossible to avoid all the grains of sand that were spread across such a wide area. Blood had splattered everywhere. The assassin who had been the first to attack Eugene was left in a truly terrible and torturous state. He had been too close to Eugene's counterattack and had already been injured, so he wasn't able to react in time. He was pierced by hundreds of sand bullets and had turned into a block of Swiss cheese. Even so, the man didn't let out a single scream. The assassins of Nahama were trained not to make a sound under any circumstances. However, even if they couldn't scream, that didn't mean they were immune to pain, and it also didn't mean they couldn't die. Unable to keep standing any longer, the assassin fell to the ground. The conditions of the other assassins were a little better. Although they were bleeding from wounds piercing into their body in several places, they weren't at any risk of collapsing. So they all took a step back and eyed Eugene. Their eyes were their only features not covered by their masks. Although one of their comrades was dying right in front of them, not a shade of fear could be seen in their eyes. That said, there weren't any traces of anger either. These assassins had no need for such emotions. This was just self-defense. For now, Eugene decided to try talking. "You're the ones who attacked me first. If I hadn't been able to avoid the attack, my crotch would have been split in two. I'll lower your weapons." Layman cried out as he ran over from the distant spot he had fallen in. "I am Layman Shulhov, a warrior serving under the emir of Kajitan Tyri al-Madani. Know that the one you are showing such hostility to is my master's guest." Although the fact that there really were assassins laying in ambush here had shaken Layman, he didn't forget the reason he had been dragged all the way here. Layman continued, "That is why you should all lower your weapons immediately and stand back. If you refuse, I will be forced to regard that as a challenge to the authority of my master, the emir of Kajitan." Even as he cried out these orders, Layman's eyes glistened with a dark emotion. But the assassins did not withdraw, nor did they show any signs of backing down. Instead, they readied themselves in fighting stances as they began to emit a cold, killing intent. And these weren't the only ones. In the distance, the sand stirred and over a dozen assassins rose from the ground. In the end, Eugene and Layman were surrounded by at least 20 assassins. Layman was shocked. Why on earth? Could it be that they didn't hear me? Although Layman tried to repeat himself, once again there was no reply. As the assassins held up their weapons, their blades shining in the sunlight, they exchanged glances among themselves. Layman stammered as he tried to convince them, I'm telling you that this man is the guest of the Emir of Khajitan. Also, he happens to be the young lord of Kiel Empire's Lionheart clan. It's useless, Eugene said with a shrug, his face showing that he had been expecting this. Layman, those words will only give these puppies even more motivation to silence us and make their decision to kill us even easier. What do you? Layman trailed off in confusion. Since they've already attacked us, there's no way they're just going to let us off. Though they might decide not to kill me, they're sure to kill you, Eugene informed him. Why wouldn't they intend to kill you, Lord Eugene? Because my dying will cause them quite a headache. That said, they can't just let me leave either. But those bastards should probably have a lot of unspeakable means to keep me from saying anything inconvenient. Like poison or drugs, they might even have spells for that. There might be a variety of methods at their disposal, but in the end, they just had a single purpose: to prevent any witnesses from divulging what they had experienced to anyone. In fact, the simplest method was just to kill them. Corpses couldn't speak and would always hold their silence. However, since the other person was a member of the Lionheart clan's main family, it was impossible for them to simply kill Eugene thoughtlessly. As such, instead of killing him, they would just have to keep him from opening his mouth. But to do that, they would first have to subdue Eugene. Layman paled. They would go so far? Just why? Who knows, Eugene replied with a snort. The assassins weren't the only ones whose motivation had increased and who now found it easier to have reached a decision. Since these guys had revealed their intent to kill, Eugene would just have to treat them similarly. After all, Eugene wasn't the one who had started this fight. Shall I make the first move? Eugene asked as his hands reached into his cloak and pulled some things out. The moment Eugene had asked this question, the assassins all kicked off the ground as one. The first to move was the assassin who had collapsed from his severe injuries and was now dying. He shouldn't even have been able to move properly, but the man still charged toward Eugene, crawling across the sand with his hands like a beast. This wasn't anything to be panicked out. Even though 300 years had passed, the assassins were still the same. They were terrifying bastards who prioritized their orders and missions over their own lives. Even if their limbs were all sliced off, they would still try to attack by wriggling their torsos like worms. During Hamel's time as a mercenary, he had clashed with them on several occasions. Thanks to that, Eugene was well aware of just how terrifying assassins could be, and he was also very familiar with the only working method to stop these bastards, apart from being the one who gave them orders. Tick. The sand in the ground formed into blades. The body of the first assassin to come running in unawares was split in half. He was dead for sure, but Eugene didn't spare the body even a single glance. The other assassins were still attacking. They may have abandoned their stealth, but their movements were so swift and agile that stealth was no longer needed. They were using each other as cover, thus confusing their numbers, and they each began preparing different venues for attacks. If one went down, the next would attack, and if he went down, the next one would still be able to put their knives to Eugene's neck. With a snicker, Eugene lowered his body. Flap. His cloak billowed and 6 throwing knives were sent flying forward. 3 from each hand. Although they were all thrown at once, each of the daggers shot off in different directions, with each knife aimed at one of the 6 assassins. They weren't just simple throwing knives either. Ting. Although all the assassins took defensive action with a mana shield, they were still forced to stagger backward. That was just how heavy the daggers Eugene had thrown were. Blades of sand then erupted beneath the feet of the assassins who had been staggered by his attack. They had already seen such an attack before, so they were able to react, but that wasn't the only threat. In an instant, the air around the assassins turned heavy. This wasn't a metaphor. The air truly did grow heavier, pressing down on their shoulders. This slowed down their actions slightly, causing the blades of sand that erupted from the ground to slice the assassins' ankles and hips. Once again, there were no screams. All the same, there weren't any cheers of joy either. Even in such a state, all the 6 assassins raised their short swords at once and threw them simultaneously, as if they had already arranged to do so. Eugene wasn't just standing still during all this. As he leaped forward, he transmitted his intentions to the gale. As his mana infused into the wind, it altered the trajectory of his daggers. There was no need for the wind to guide the daggers the whole way. Just a slight twist in their trajectories had been enough to create an opening. An opening that Eugene didn't miss. Hey! Eugene's empty hands grabbed onto the heads of 2 assassins, pushed them backward and smashed them down to the ground. His cloak flapped open as he fell, and when he came back up, both of Eugene's hands were holding onto a large axe. Quadaduke. The axe that Eugene swung with the rotational force of his entire body chopped right through the bodies of the nearby assassins. Blood sprayed out and intestines spilled across the ground. Eugene didn't remain attached to the axe after swinging it once. After he had chopped everyone nearby into two, he let go of the axe, and as the axe flew away, still spinning in circles, it embedded itself into the chest of another assassin. Apart from that axe, Eugene had many other weapons. Since he didn't know what might happen once he got to Nahama, he had made sure to prepare thoroughly. He had enough food and water to last for several months, as well as adequate changes of underwear. After he was finished preparing things like that, he had stuck all sorts of weapons into the cloak. Among all the weapons he had stored away like this, axes alone just counted for 20 of them. Hamel, why do you go around carrying all those weapons that you never even use? If I have them with me, I'm sure I'll use them sometime. Leave him alone, Anise. I'm telling you that this bastard won't listen to you no matter what you say to him. And also, well, there's nothing wrong with being well prepared. But Sienna, Hamel's behavior shouldn't be encouraged. All those useless weapons belong to Hamel, so why does Molen have to pull the cart carrying them? It's because I won when we played rock, paper, scissors. But that's not fair either. Why were you staking who has to pull your luggage on a game of rock, paper, scissors with Molen? Why do you keep making me out to be a bad guy? Do you really think that's just my luggage over there? I can see an awful lot of jars of that holy water that you like so much. There's also the axe that belongs to that bastard Molen. That axe is the heaviest thing on the cart. If I was really the only one who uses my holy water, I would definitely carry it all by myself. But that's not the case now, is it? You and Sienna, you two brats are always the ones who end up coveting my holy water the most. Also, doesn't that idiot Molen always make a fist whenever he plays rock, paper, scissors? Do you really think it's fair to play rock, paper, scissors with such a fool? What about Sienna? Isn't she the one who invited me to drink your holy water with her? And in the first place, we wouldn't need to drag the cart with us if she could just store our luggage using her summoning magic. Why the hell are you blaming me when you're the one who said that you would just travel while carrying your luggage because it was hard to take things out quickly right when you needed them? Vermouth. You motherfucker, don't just stay silent and say something. Why don't you ever take turns pulling the cart? None of my weapons are on there. Must be nice for you. Subspace magic sure sounds fucking convenient. It does sound convenient, doesn't it? Isn't that why I've said you should let me teach you magic? Although I've never taught anyone before, I feel like I should probably be good at teaching. If you get down on your knees and beg. I might just be willing to lose a little sleep so that I can kindly teach you a thing or two. In his previous life, he had often been chastised by Anise for going around carrying so many weapons. If I just had a cloak like this in my previous life, I definitely wouldn't have been forced to listen to so many insults. As Eugene thought wistfully, he inserted his hands into the cloak, and when they came out, they were holding two long-bladed spears. It was overwhelming. Layman had taken a few steps forward to help Eugene, but stunned by the sight in front of him, he had frozen in place, unable to advance any further. There wasn't any need for Layman's help. The 20-plus assassins looked like a herd of sheep that had met a wolf. No, like ants who were being trampled beneath a person's feet. The storm sword WYD, which was known to be one of the treasures of the Lionheart clan, didn't even make an appearance, and Eugene didn't actively cast any offensive spells either. Apart from the intermittent casting of Blink, his magic was just used as a support during any critical moments. Unable to believe what his eyes were showing him, Layman violently shook his head. Eugene was left standing in the center of the assassins' strewn corpses. Rubbing off the blood splashed onto his cheek, he scanned his surroundings. Not a single assassin remained alive. Layman struggled to find his voice. Was there really a need to kill all of them? I don't have the talents needed to open the mouths of these assassins, replied Eugene as the wind moved at his command. The weapons he had used and then tossed away floated into the air and returned to Eugene. The wind cleanly blew away the blood and bits of flesh that had covered his weapons as they flew towards him. There also isn't any need to interrogate them, Eugene added. Layman stayed silent. Furthermore, there's no need to search their bodies. Because the assassins won't carry anything that could be used to prove their identities. After he placed all his weapons back inside his cloak, Eugene turned to look at Layman. Do you plan to keep going? He asked. Huh. Layman grunted in surprise. I mean, the reason I brought you here was to use your master's name for assistance. But these jokers seem to look down on the Emir of Khajitan. So there's no reason to drag you with me any further, Eugene explained. Layman stammered. That might be the case, but I can't just return like this. Why not? It's not like you need to worry about me. Is it because you want to personally confirm what's going on in front of us? Eugene asked. Layman's silence was enough of an answer. Eugene hesitated. It's not like you'll be of much help. Layman weakly persuaded him. I'll try not to be a burden for you, my lord. Fine, do as you like. But don't expect me to be duty-bound to help you out. As Eugene's reply trailed off, he started to walk past all the corpses. It was at that moment. Rumble, rumble. The desert shook and the mana in the atmosphere fluctuated. Eugene felt an enormous amount of mana being formed into a spell underfoot. He immediately escaped from that spot with a blink and climbed high up into the sky with the wind supporting his body. The sand beneath his feet had started bubbling like a pot. The assassins' corpses were covered in a red light, and Eugene saw them melt like ice. They were being used as an offering. Eugene's eyes widened at this realization. My lord! Layman cried out. The desert had been transformed into a swamp. Even though the ground had been fine despite all the bursts of wind earlier, in an instant, the entire area had been converted into quicksand. As Layman leaped around trying to resist the force sucking at his feet, he yelled at Eugene, "Please run away." Eugene had been expecting Layman to scream for help, but instead he had shouted something unexpected like this. Eugene was perplexed by his shout, but he wasn't in a situation where he could pay any attention to Layman. The air was roaring with noise. Different from the winds created by his summoned spirits, another kind of unnatural wind was whirling below Eugene. Soon it had formed into a massive tornado. Kazani was known for its sudden sandstorms, but no matter how sudden they might be, a sand tornado that appeared from out of nowhere like this and swelled in size was clearly abnormal. It's a magic. Layman gasped, his face contorting. It was just as Eugene had said earlier. Most of the things one wished were not true turned out to be the truth. Especially when these truths were allegations about someone you respected actually being a shithead. Layman had no choice but to admit this. Kazani's sandstorms were caused by the sand shamans. This meant that the sandstorm that had engulfed Layman's village was also caused by the sand shamans. Gah! Layman roared and pulled out his kukri. He frantically started swinging his kukri at the tornado, which was slowly growing in size. But unfortunately, this was a meaningless endeavor. Layman's skills made it impossible for him to slice apart that huge sandstorm. The same went for Eugene as well. As such, he didn't even bother trying. He didn't want to waste any valuable strength by attempting the impossible. Eugene instead fixed himself in the air so as not to be dragged around by the sandstorm. The gale's winds weren't enough to help him escape the sandstorm. All it could do was help him endure the pull. Then would a blink be enough to get him out of here? Just as he was about to try it, Eugene stopped. Something was rising from below the quicksand. Eugene slightly shifted his position while still in midair. He glanced down at Layman, who was still swinging his kukri in one slash after another as he was being sucked beneath the quicksand. Eugene clicked his tongue and sent some of his wind over to Layman. Ugh! Layman, who was about to be sucked under, grunted as the wind pulled him free. Layman turned to look up at Eugene as his legs continued to pedal in midair. Eugene had sent some of the wind holding him in place over to Layman, causing his body to gradually be drawn towards the tornado. Layman cried out in concern, "My lord! Get going, you idiot!" Eugene roared out this order and then turned his gaze away from Layman. In any case, the wind's help wouldn't be needed for what Eugene had planned next. Eugene gathered the remaining wind supporting him into one spot, concentrating its strength so that he could endure the tornado's pull for now. Meanwhile, he was slowly descending to the ground. Eugene kept a count, 1, 2, 3, 4, now. Pwah! Something burst out from the middle of the quicksand. It was a sandworm with its jaws stretched wide open. It wasn't just a normal sandworm, but a giant sandworm whose length had to be several tens of meters long. It was a scavenger that devoured anything that walked into the desert. My lord! Layman howled in worry. Open wide, you bastard, Eugene growled as he looked down into the sandworm's jaws. He could see thousands of tiny teeth gnashing away. Behind these teeth, bare flesh continued down into the worm like a winding passageway. Phew, Eugene took a deep breath and flipped up the hood attached to the cloak of darkness. Then he placed both hands inside the cloak and sighed, even though I never wanted to do something like this again. Eugene reluctantly recalled some terrible memories from his previous life that he had tried to repress. They were from his time in the desert of Helmuth. The sandworms there were even bigger and more ferocious than the sandworms in Nahama. Molin, you foolish bastard. That bastard really was an absolute fool. When the cart he was pulling got swallowed whole by a sandworm, Molin immediately leaped into the sandworm's jaws while saying that he was going to retrieve their belongings. While everyone else was frozen in shock and confusion, Hamel had also run into the sandworm's jaws in order to save that fool. He didn't really want to think about what happened after that. Eugene took a couple of deep breaths as he shuddered in disgust. This is still better than back then, he reassured himself. At least I don't need to save Molin, that idiot, this time around. The gale's wind disappeared. Having been thrown outside the quicksand, Layman's eyes widened at the sight of the sandworm rising from the depths of the earth and its gaping jaws. He continued watching as Eugene was swallowed by, leaped into the sandworm's jaws. Or at least that's how it appeared to Layman's eyes. I loot, Layman wailed. It was all because he had to save me. Layman burst into tears at this thought. These were the tears of a warrior who owed his life to another. Layman let out a roar of determination as he kicked off the sand. Although Eugene had thrown him well out of the reach of the quicksand, Layman picked up his kukri and charged at the sandworm. From now on, the source of the sandstorms was no longer Layman's true enemy. He had decided to dedicate himself to the quest of slicing open the sandworm's stomach and rescuing Eugene. Eugene, of course, was unaware of Layman's newfound determination. This fucking stinks. The smell was worse than Garjatha's body odor. Eugene stopped breathing through his nose and crouched down. His sturdy mana shield and the cloak of darkness had allowed Eugene to pass the sandworm's teeth and enter its winding esophagus. Then Eugene had summoned the gale once more to guide the direction of his falling body. This long, gigantic sandworm had become a living passageway that guided Eugene down into the depths of the earth. Fortunately, the sandworms of Nahama had the same internal structures as the sandworms of Helmuth. Sandworms swallowed most things they found walking on the surface of the desert. First, their teeth, which grew in a circle around the inside of their mouths, would chew their prey into fine pieces. Then this mulch would go down through their esophagus, break down even further inside the stomach and enter the intestines, where it would meander deeper and deeper into the worm. As the sandworm's food continued following this disgusting path, it would simply continue to decompose without ever being excreted. This damned monster didn't even have an anus, so it couldn't shit. It was a highly fuel-efficient monster that completely decomposed everything it ate and converted all of its food into energy. As such, this meant that once you entered, there was no way out. His mana shield and the cloak of darkness allowed Eugene to resist the monster's digestive issues. While still making sure to continue breathing through his mouth, Eugene assessed his current position. He could see that this disgusting passage he was crawling down was slowly coming to an end. Fuck, this stinks. As Eugene spat out this curse, he pulled out Fush. By operating his white flame formula to its limits and then spinning it, Eugene transformed the formula into his own ring flame formula. Inside the circle drawn by his stars, countless stars were born and exploded. The mana that was amplified through this method caused Eugene's flames to burn even stronger. This pure white flame was the symbol of the white flame formula, but as the density of mana in the flame increased, the closer Eugene's flame got to a color other than white. It was beginning to shine with a pale blue light. This appearance could no longer be called by the same name as the white flame formula. With bloodshot eyes, Eugene held up WMYD. His mana flames engulfed WMED, and then the wind emitted from WME mixed with his flames. Eugene stabbed downwards with WMED, its blade covered in pale blue light. Squelch. The noise of the blade sinking in wasn't loud. However, the sandworm's huge body quickly shook from the pain of it. Eugene had carved out an anus for this poor monster who was born without one.